quickly. Settle down.
In less than a month of war, the Allied armies were everywhere in retreat. Each day brought new discouragements. For the most part, they were falling back in good order, organizing rearguard operations to cover withdrawals, and performing almost suicidal spoiling attacks when cornered.
The French, also reeling from the attacks initially, were able to get lots of reinforcements brought in their taxicab army from Paris and stop the Germans at the Meuse River. Back and forth a few times, but it ended up that the Germans ended up on one side and they ended up on the other.
With the Germans pressing ever forward and Plan 17 in shreds, the impassive General Joffre exerted his will over the entire front. On August 24th, Joffre made a decision that changed history. Refusing to abandon all thoughts of an offensive, he created a new Sixth Army, commanded by General Minori on the endangered Allied left. He did this by coolly taking troops from his own reserves and the French right just for this purpose. On August 26th, Joffre went to his second meeting with Sir John French. The scene was witnessed by a young liaison officer, Lieutenant Spears.
Joffre began to explain the purport of an order, extremely important, he'd issued. Whilst he was doing so, in walked Lansac, bustling in. Then Joffre went on explaining this order of his, when Sir John French said, "What about this order? I haven't seen an order." Whereupon General Wilson, the Sub-Chief of Staff, explained rather awkwardly, I thought, that some order had been received during the night, but it hadn't been dealt with yet. I got the impression it had been translated. When General Joffre realized that his orders hadn't even been received and read by the British, he seemed overwhelmed with discouragement. It was the only time I've ever known that he seemed to lose heart himself, to be completely deflated.
This was an abject moment for General Joffre.
When I left British headquarters in the early afternoon, I carried away with me a serious impression of the fragility of our extreme left, and I anxiously asked myself if it could hold out long enough to enable me to regroup our forces. If this maneuver was to succeed, two essential conditions had to be fulfilled. First, our Fourth and Fifth Armies must interrupt their retreat with partial offensives and counterattacks to give me time to assemble a new army on our left. Secondly, the British would have to resist tenaciously and yield ground only very slowly.
That is exactly what Smith-Dorrien's British forces were about to do at Les Cateaux. Joffre's calmness and rational approach under pressure was in total contrast to the increasing nervousness of his opponent, Moltke. The German chief of the General Staff was allowing fleeting operational opportunities to obscure the original strategic aim. The dazzling prospect of achieving a double envelopment of the Allied armies had already persuaded him to give the commanders of the left-wing armies their head. On August 23rd, he further dismantled the Schlieffen Plan by releasing 2 corps from the key right wing to help block the Russian advance in East Prussia. Given that, formations had already been detached to deal with various fortresses. The 3 German right-wing armies had by now lost more than a quarter of their strength and had still not fulfilled their principal task. For the Allied and German troops who had to march some 20 miles a day in the searing late August heat, thirst, fatigue, hunger, and blistered feet were of much greater concern than the grand designs of their commanders. After the Battle of Mons, the BEF's two corps had become separated by the forest of Mormal. On August 26th, the anniversary of the legendary English victory at the Battle of Crécy, Smith-Dorrien judged that the Germans were so close to Second Corps that they could not disengage without fighting another battle. Contrary to the wishes of Sir John French, he conducted a determined holding action at Les Cateaux, where the Germans again suffered severely in the face of the BEF's concentrated rifle fire.
They come up like a football crowd leaving Hampstead Park. They come marching up in droves, firing their rifles from their right hips. They have absolutely no idea of aim.
The cavalry and horse artillery poured it on to the advancing enemy, but the infantry was swarmed by the German lines. Yet the Tommies held on. Once again, the British Enfield rifles had wonderful targets.
There's a letter I read from a machine gunner, German, who wrote his wife. And the British did lead a cavalry charge against an entrenched machine gun position. One of the things that was noticed was he was ordered to open fire. He did. In 15 minutes, there were riderless horses. In 15 minutes, there were men crying for their mothers in the wire. In 15 minutes, there were horses wrapped in the wire, dying and went neighing, last gasp of life, could not get out of the wire, being cut to pieces in their flesh. In 15 minutes, he put his head down on his machine gun, and he said, "I could no longer fire." This was not war. It was murder.
The slaughter took a toll on the assaulting troops, and, surprisingly, on the gunners as well.
The other machine gunners in the company stopped because they could no longer do it. The officers yelled at them and urged them to keep firing, because the difference between the enlisted man and the officer knew, if you do not kill your enemy, they will come back to kill you tomorrow. That is the nature of the war.
We'd hardly got our head covered before the ridge, about 3/4 of a mile away, was literally swarming with Germans in their field grey uniforms. And they advanced, and we received the order to rapid fire. It was probably 3/4 of a mile away, an extreme range for a rifle, but we rapid fired at 15 rounds a minute at these advancing Germans, and they broke up into smaller groups of probably 6 or 8, advancing through a cornfield where the corn was in stooks. As we rapid fired, they took cover behind these stooks of corn.
The English infantry stiffened once again. The morning hours passed slowly as more and more Germans entered the fight. The last British reserves were thrown in to meet this new danger.
We were in reserve. The brigade was formed up, and orders came that we were required on the left of the line. We go fast. And we marched 4 miles over the left of the line, came to a village whose name I don't really remember, and found Smith-Dorrien standing outside his headquarters, and he waved to us as we passed and said, "I think we're holding them all right. It won't be wanted here. And everything's going fine."
The exposed artillery batteries on the right flank lost heavily that morning. Men on the battle line, weary, suffering from the heat, began to drift away from the battle. It was time to go, if it could be managed. The biggest problem was to remove the guns. The limbers and the crews were smashed to pieces on the hillside. Dead horses and dead men were everywhere. The teams that were left dashed forward through jeering infantry.
As they came within view of the enemy, they were struck by a hurricane of shrapnel and bullets from machine guns. But still they went on. The officer in charge of the teams was killed. One team shot down in a heap before the position was reached. But 2 guns of the 122nd Battery were carried out without mishap. A third was limbered up, but the horses went down instantly.
The rest had to be left to the Germans. Incredibly, the 3 divisions of Smith-Dorrien Corps slipped away, and the Germans had no idea where they had gone. It was the British Army's first real battle, and the cost was considerable. Second Corps lost 7,182 officers and men and 38 guns. Now they were retreating again. Tired and dirty, but because of their timely stand, they were able to continue their retreat in relatively good order.
We marched day after day. We got very little food. I'd eaten my emergency rations at Bleecker 2, which of course I shouldn't have done. We had a tin of bully beef. I'd eaten that as well. And we were all very, very hungry. We certainly did get a cup of tea occasionally, or a canteen of tea. And we marched through a forest, which was very cold and dank. We were marching during the daytime, very big forest. It was very cold in this forest.
On they marched over dust-covered roads, through the heat of the day. On they marched, 30 miles to the south and the banks of the Somme.
I've seen infantry there with their feet bleeding. I've seen infantry with their boots off and puttees wrapped round them. I've seen men sobbing and turning round asking our officers, why the hell can't we fight? Why won't you let us fight?
It was a hopeless sight. Footsore soldiers and terrified civilians in a single mass of humanity. And that hopelessness began to reach the Allied commander, Joffre.
It was a very, very strange thing to see a single man exercising his will over a mass of about 1 million men with the fate of his country in balance, having to satisfy the political requirements of his own government, the British government, having to face a catastrophic situation and never getting rattled.
Smith-Dorrien's strained relations with Sir John French deteriorated beyond repair after Le Cateau. Yet the standby Second Corps achieved its objective, for it not only led the Germans to overestimate British strength, but also deterred Kluck from immediate pursuit. Moreover, Kluck's mistaken conclusion that the BEF was falling back southwest rather than to the south gave the British formations an unexpected breathing space, permitting them to retreat comparatively unmolested over the next few days. The respite did not dispel Sir John's gloom. Feeling let down by the French and disheartened by the BEF's casualties, he now believed that he could only save the Expeditionary Force by taking it out of the Allied line of battle and retiring behind the Seine. It took the personal intervention of Kitchener in a hastily arranged visit to France on September 1st to prevent Sir John from following this course. But even with Kitchener's intervention and Joffre's cool demeanor, it still seemed that the only thing that could save the Allies in the West was a miracle. It was the 35th day. That is what the Kaiser reminded his ministers during a meeting at his Luxembourg headquarters on the morning of September 4th, 1914. It lay halfway between the 31st day since mobilization, when the map drawn by Schlieffen himself showed the German armies poised to begin their descent on Paris, and the 40th, when his calculations determined that there would have been a decisive battle. That battle's outcome was critical. Schlieffen had calculated that the deficiencies of the Russian railways would ensure that not until the 40th day would the Tsar's armies be assembled in sufficient strength to launch an offensive. After the BEF had escaped his clutches, General Kluck was freed from Bülow's direct command on August 27th and headed southwest towards Amiens. By August 28th, the BEF was less of a priority to him as he began to consider wheeling inwards, a move which might enable him to push General Lanrezac away from Paris and to roll up the French Fifth Army's left. At this juncture, General Joffre ordered an unenthusiastic Lanrezac to turn his face to the west and counterattacked between Guise and Saint-Quentin. The Germans were surprised by the strength of the opposition, against which they began to suffer heavy losses. Yet, on August 29th, the Guard Corps and the Hanoverians of 10th Corps advanced some 3 miles, and as evening approached were preparing to consolidate the ground they'd won. At that moment, the character of the battle was transformed by the courage of one man. The prestigious Guard Corps of the Second Army and the Hanoverians were assaulted at Guise by the French First Corps, commanded by the energetic Franchet d'Espèrey. Mounted on a chestnut charger, surrounded by his staff at the head of the regiments, Franchet d'Espèrey ordered the colors unfurled and the bands to play. With banners flying, corps artillery thundering overhead, Desperate Frankie, as the British admiringly christened the French fire eater, led his red-trousered infantry into the attack. It was the last of the old-time pageants of war. And it worked. They threw the stunned Germans back. Without seeking Moltke's prior agreement, on August 30th, Kluck ordered the First Army to prematurely execute the wheel inwards. Instead of passing west of the French capital as planned, the First Army would pass northeast of it. This exposed Kluck's flank to attack by Manor's French Sixth Army, now positioned north of Paris. The straining Schlieffen plan broke down at last. With both events and his subordinates rapidly slipping beyond control, Moltke tamely gave his blessing to Kluck's maneuver. The glittering opportunity offered by Kluck's swerve inwards was not immediately appreciated by the Allies. One effect of the move was to bring Kluck back into contact with the BEF.
A place called Villers-Cotterêts, which when the nearness of Paris began to penetrate our tiredness, and we noticed the kilometre stones at the side of the road. Gradually, we were getting nearer and nearer to Paris, 25, 24, 23. We couldn't believe it was happening to us, but every step nearer to Paris, as witnessed by these kilometre stones, were another blow on the head, which increased our depression, and we mentally felt that should we reach zero, that is Paris itself, that as far as we were concerned, we'd have lost the war.
Having retreated 200 miles, the BEF crossed the Marne on September 3rd, but aerial reconnaissance finally revealed the vulnerability of Kluck's left flank. On September 4th and 5th, von Moltke issued the orders that would set into motion the decisive battle the Schlieffen Plan envisioned. Von Moltke realized on the 4th that the enemy had eluded the enveloping attack of First and Second Armies and had succeeded in gaining contact with the defensive positions protecting Paris. First and Second Armies were therefore ordered to take a defensive position. Third Army was to advance towards the Upper Seine. The German Fourth and Fifth Armies were to attack to the southeast, with the objective of opening a way for the Sixth and Seventh to complete the encirclement of the enemy. This was the opposite of what Schlieffen had intended. Joffre was quick to see this.
When, on the afternoon that he decided on the Battle of the Marne, I've never seen, very few people have ever seen anybody with such a burden placed on his shoulders, with nobody to help, just weighing the pros and cons of this movement and that movement, what orders to issue. It lasted quite a long time, perhaps a couple of hours. And then he got up, his decision was taken.
For 15 days, the Germans had been advancing on Paris. By September 4th, they were less than 20 miles from the city. But for the General Staff, hope was waning and time was running out. At French headquarters on September 4th, Joffre had issued General Instruction Number 6, which exactly anticipated Moltke's recognition of his predicament and proposed a means to exploit it. Accordingly, the French Sixth Army, at the outermost extremity, was to cross the Ourcq, a tributary of the Marne, and advance around the German flank, while the BEF, the Fifth Army, and Foch's Ninth Army were to make a fighting advance northward. Effective date of the order was September 6th. The Germans, not the French army, were to be the target of encirclement. What stood in the way of the conception of the order and the completion of the maneuver were water barriers, tributaries to the Marne that would define the coming battle. Those waterways would define the line of action, and that line would favor the Germans, along with the quick thinking by a commander on the spot at a critical moment. That man was General von Grenau, an artillery officer commanding 4th Reserve Corps. On the morning of September 5th, as Minori's 6th Army probed forward to take up an attacking position for the following day, von Grenau received a disquieting report from his cavalry scouts. The mounted patrols located advancing French troops all across the front. As 4th Reserve Corps was aligned at right angles to the waterway and to the rear of von Kluck's 1st Army, that meant that the enemy was maneuvering to take 1st Army in the flank and roll it up. Von Grenau's response was instantaneous and courageous. He decided to attack. As Minori's advance guard moved forward toward the Ourcq in the mid-morning of September 5th, they were suddenly brought under fire by the Germans, who were occupying terrain supposedly empty. The French went to ground. As darkness fell, von Grenau wisely judged he had won the time necessary to save 1st Army from surprise attack, and carefully disengaged his troops. In the bright moonlight, the French followed, launching attacks against positions the Germans had already abandoned. Thanks to von Grenau's independent action, the beckoning open flank, which offered the opportunity for encirclement, had been covered, and von Kluck given the warning necessary to hurry reinforcements from his center to the right before the danger increased. A portion of the garrison of Paris was rushed to the front by commandeered taxicabs. They prevented a total collapse of the French army, but they could not prevent Minori's units from being pushed back. Kluck's further movement westward again extended the gap between the German 1st and 2nd Armies. Bülow, too, had responded capably to the pressure exerted by the French 5th Army and the newly created 9th Army under General Foch. By its 3rd day, the Allied counterstroke was faltering in several places, and the battle-weary soldiers repulsed with heavy losses. But at the most critical moment of the battle on September 9th, it was the Germans who lost their nerve. The powerful Imperial Army slowly gave way. As the BEF recrossed the Marne and advanced cautiously into the gap between the two German right-wing armies, an anxious and exhausted Bülow ordered a retreat. His decision was endorsed by Lieutenant Colonel Hensch, a hard-working but impressionable staff officer sent to the front to represent the utterly demoralized Moltke. Kluck was left with no option but to retire northwards to the Aisne with Bülow. The miracle of the Marne saved Paris and dealt the final blow to German plans for a swift victory in the west. While the nerves of Moltke and Bülow had given way, the stolid Joffre had retained his grip, his reputation, and his authority as the savior of France, and would become unshakable in the following months. Moltke, on the other hand, did not survive long in office. On September 14th, General Erich von Falkenhayn was given control of operations. Although to preserve appearances and morale, Moltke kept his post in name only until November 3rd. However, if the Allies had gained a momentous strategic success on the Marne, they were still a very long way from defeating the German armies. Despite their reverse on the Marne, the armies on the German right wing fell back to strong defensive positions, especially the Chemin des Dames ridge, some 4 miles north of the river Aisne, between Craonne and Soissons. This steep wooded ridge had a series of finger-like spurs extending down toward the Aisne. It was here on the BEF's line of advance that a significant gap remained between the German 1st and 2nd Armies. The gap was an inviting target for the Allies, but neither the BEF nor neighboring French formations could push on quickly enough to exploit the situation.
I thought our movements very slow today, in view of the fact that the enemy is on the run.
Too slow. Blown bridges, weary soldiers, overcautious commanders, and brave rearguard actions by German troops all combined to delay the Allied advance. The delays cost the Allies dearly. The fall of Maubeuge on September 7th released German troops for other tasks, and the 7th Reserve Corps, under General von Zuil, rushed to plug the gap on the German right. Following a march of 40 miles in 24 hours, during which a quarter of its infantry dropped out, leading elements of the Corps reached positions along the Chemin des Dames by 2 p.m. on September 13th, 2 hours before the vanguard of Haig's 1st Corps on the British right approached the crest. Though few recognized it at the time, this was one of the defining moments of the war. The stalemate of trench warfare had arrived on the Western Front.
In front of this corps and for many miles on either side, affairs have reached a deadlock, and no decision seems possible in this area.
With deadlock gripping the front from the Aisne eastward, each side tried to turn the other's open flank to the west and north in what became known as the Race to the Sea. Manory's French 6th Army struck first astride the Oise on September 17th, but was blocked near Noyon by the German 9th Reserve Corps moving down from Antwerp. 2 days later, another German corps coming from Reims stopped an advance over the Avre by de Castelnau's 2nd Army, itself brought from Lorraine to bolster the Allied left. Joffre formed a new 10th Army under General de Moreuil, which attempted to get around the German right flank further north, but subsequently struggled early in October to hold Arras against a thrust by 3 German corps. In late September, the French beat back repeated assaults at Verdun, although the German 5th Army under Crown Prince Wilhelm gained ground in the Argonne Forest, and a troublesome German salient was established on the western bank of the Meuse. At Saint-Mihiel, the Poilu held.
Poilu is a term that literally means hairy or scruffy. It was a term of endearment that the French people had on the French soldier, the common guy, the dirty, gnarly, nasty foot soldier. It would seem sort of like a derogatory term to call someone basically a dirtbag, but they loved it. They considered it as a sort of grunt status, if you want to put it in U.S. terms, or dog face. You know, it's a rough, dirty, and ready to rumble type of name.
With the end of this action, the shape which the Western Front would largely retain until 1918 was fast being molded. Worried about becoming enmeshed in the Aisne stalemate, Sir John French urged Joffre to allow the BEF to disengage and resume its former position on the Allied left. Tactically, the BEF, lacking heavy artillery but possessing effective cavalry, would be of greater value on the open left flank, while strategically, it seemed sensible to shorten its lines of communication with the Channel ports. Despite the problems which would arise from the passage of British divisions across French lines of communication, Joffre sanctioned the move. On October 1st, the BEF began a sidestep to the Flanders Plain, a region which would become one of the main fields of carnage for the remainder of the war. In the first 3 weeks of October, Smith-Dorrien's 2nd Corps pushed towards La Bassée. While to the north, Major General Pulteney's 3rd Corps advanced toward Lille. The Cavalry Corps, commanded by Lieutenant General Edmund Allenby on Pulteney's left, occupied Messines and Uichâtel, linking with the recently formed 4th Corps, which, after the surrender of Antwerp, was ordered to Ypres. The coordination of operations between Oise and the sea was entrusted by Joffre de Foch, who was appointed to head a new Northern Army group. There was no formal unity of command between the Allies, and Foch had no direct powers over the British and the Belgians. But in practice, His allies, whenever possible, acted upon his proposals rapidly and without friction at this stage of the war. Such cooperation was essential, for Falkenhayn was currently displaying a deft strategic touch, using railways cleverly to gain a vital edge in redeploying and reinforcing his armies. With the Germans setting the pace, the Allies were at a greater risk of being outflanked in late October and early November. The German Sixth Army, which had moved across the front from Lorraine, strove to dislodge the Allies from their positions at La Bassée and Menin. A reconstituted Fourth Army under Duke Albrecht von Württemberg closed in on Ypres. The latter formation included 4 new reserve corps, with a large proportion of highly motivated young volunteers from universities and technical colleges, who, although hurriedly trained, offered Falkenhayn a potentially decisive advantage as he sought to outflank the Allied left and drive down the Channel coast. As the German Fourth Army pounded what was left of the Belgian army at Ypres, the BEF had largely clung to its defensive positions at Messines, Ploeg Street, and La Bassée. The farmland surrounding the Belgian town of Ypres was now the only sector where either side had a real chance of outflanking the enemy. Arriving from the Aisne on October 20th, Haig's First Corps advanced north of Ypres near Langemarck, where they ran head-on into the German 24th and 26th Reserve Corps, approaching from the northeast. Far from striking a decisive blow, the Allies became embroiled in a fluctuating encounter battle, during which they were compelled to feed in units piecemeal simply to hold their ground. On the German side, the patriotism of the young volunteer bourgeois German students rushed to the front could not disguise their limited training. They fell in the thousands at Langemarck, attacking in dense skirmish lines. They were cut to pieces by the Tommy riflemen and machine guns.
We ran approximately 100 yards when we came under a machine gun fire which was so terrific that the losses were so staggering that we got orders to lie down and to seek shelter. Nobody dared to lift his head because the very moment the machine gunners saw any movement, they let fly. And then the British artillery opened up. And the corpses, and the heads, and the arms, and the legs flew about, and we were cut to pieces.
The action became known as Der Kindermord bei Ypres, the so-called Massacre of the Innocents at Ypres. The Innocents were student volunteers in the German Reserve Corps, slaughtered in droves, but who went to their deaths singing. Some 25,000 student soldiers found a home for eternity in a mass grave at Langemarck. Their sacrifice was later accorded a special place in Nazi mythology. Although the front remained fluid, trenches were slowly snaking across the flat farmland. Aware by the evening of October 24th that the Reserve Corps assaults would probably fail, the German High Command decided to make a fresh attack a few miles further south, between Geluvelt and Messines. There, on October 29th, a task force under General von Fabeck renewed German efforts to achieve a breakthrough. The Allies experienced a major crisis on October 31st, when the British positions at Geluvelt were overrun. But, as at Langemarck, the Germans lost cohesion after the initial breach, again exposing weaknesses in their training. A bold counterattack by 357 officers and men of the 2nd Worcestershires drove the Germans from Geluvelt. Over the next few days, Allenby's cavalry and the French were pushed off Messines Ridge. The situation was stabilized, however, with the deployment of extra French troops on the BEF's flanks. Another assault on November 11th saw a composite Prussian Guard division break through the British lines just north of the Menin Road. Once more employing obsolete, tightly packed formations, the Germans were halted by a combination of point-blank British artillery fire and a scratch force which included cooks, headquarter clerks, and engineers. Not knowing that this represented the last line of British resistance, the Prussian Guard faltered and was then cleared from the Nuns' Woods by a vigorous counterattack by the 2nd Oxfordshire and Buckinghamshire Light Infantry. The Allies had survived the last crisis of 1914. Within a week or so, snow cloaked the battlefield, and the grandiose plans of the belligerents lay in ruins. The transfer of 4 German cavalry and 8 infantry divisions to the Eastern Front by early December underlined Falkenhayn's acknowledgement of the fact, and so did his officers in the trenches.
The war has got stuck into a gigantic siege on both sides. The whole front is one endless fortified trench. Neither side has the force to make a decisive push.
Despite gaining a great deal of valuable territory in Belgium and northern France, the Germans now faced their ultimate nightmare, a prolonged two-front war, the very scenario they had sought to avoid.
Everyone is getting ready for a winter campaign. As far as I can judge, there is no possibility of an early finish.
2 days later, the same officer wrote,
"We are still stuck here for perfectly good reasons. One might as well say for perfectly bad reasons."
The original, highly trained professional BEF was also gone. It had done much to halt the German drive on the Channel ports, but suffered 58,000 additional casualties between October 14th and November 30th. The forces of the British Empire had begun their long and bloody association with Ypres, where the Allies occupied a hazardous salient dominated by German-held ridges.
Luckily for the Germans, their trenches were on the high ground, and therefore they could see a lot further, see the movement behind the Allied trenches, and also the drainage in that general area, particularly in Belgium, was particularly wet. So therefore, the British and the French couldn't dig very deep without their trenches becoming flooded. The Germans, on the other hand, had the option of going pretty deep. As the war progressed, the trenches themselves, which went from Switzerland all the way up to the North Sea, hundreds of miles, as the Germans were being pushed back, they were setting up more formidable defenses, such as the Hindenburg Line, which had a lot more concrete bunkers, machine gun nests, emplacements, tons of barbed wire, really a defense in depth to particularly slow down any advance that the Allies might be able to push through, and for them to immediately counterattack, which was one of their strong points as well.
Trench warfare was now a fact of life on the Western Front. Diabolical though they often were, trench systems came into existence for good, practical, and tactical reasons. The idea of all field works was to protect and hide troops. The particular conditions which emerged during the latter part of 1914 made trenches a necessity rather than an option. Killing power had developed exponentially. In 1814, a soldier in battle would have been lucky to achieve 3 musket shots per minute to an effective range of about 100 meters. In 1914, the bolt-action rifle made 10 aimed rounds per minute at 500 meters perfectly practical. In 1814, field guns could not usually be fired more than once a minute, generally used solid shot, and few were of much effect beyond 1,000 meters. By 1914, quick-fire breech-loading field guns were routinely throwing air-bursting shrapnel rounds more than 10 times a minute out to more than 5,000 meters. At the same time, the number of men and weapons had vastly increased. The German army had seen the greatest expansion, being 10 times the size of the Prussian army of the Napoleonic period. but all armies had grown several-fold. By 1914, rapid movements were channeled by timetables and rail tracks, while telegraphs, telephones, and balloons gave warning of a foe's approach. Moreover, on the Western Front, the forces of the Entente and Central Powers were too finely balanced to allow for immediate victory. The alternatives in late 1914 were stark: dig in and accept heavy casualties, or stay on the surface indefinitely and be annihilated. As one Canadian wrote, they had to hide in the mud of the trenches to escape German bullets. It was a choice of mud or death. The principal aim of field fortification is to enable the soldier to use his weapon with the greatest effect, the second to protect him from enemy fire, thus reducing losses and increasing the power of resistance in any part of the battlefield. More troops would be available to swell the force destined for decisive action there or elsewhere. The conundrum of the Great War was that there were so many men with such effective weapons so evenly balanced that there was no elsewhere. The war was only ever static in a geographic sense. There was a constant tactical, technological, and industrial evolution, whereby the trench deadlock would eventually be broken. The war would develop so quickly that a man wounded in 1914 and returning to the front in 1916 would have had some difficulty understanding that it was the same war. The infantry were universally supplied with entrenching tools to provide their own cover. Improvised cover could be dug fairly quickly and give temporary protection for a prone rifleman, a hole 12 inches deep. It was estimated that a good job could be made within the hour. British troops were taught to work lying down and to commence at the rear of the selected position. Hard soil is more easily broken up by this method, and a hollow for the disengaged arm is gradually provided, which helps keep the digger under cover. Kneeling cover could be made by linking individual scrapes together, but was better done on pre-planned lines, using reliefs of troops in a systematic manner. According to the manual, a 3-foot fire trench of adequate dimension to cover its diggers could be created in 100 minutes. A standing fire trench would require upwards of 5 hours and was likely to require 2 shifts. Sandbags and barbed wire were in very limited supply in 1914, and brushwood, sacks, sod, and timber revetments were all used. French manuals placed particular emphasis on making fascines and gabions from natural materials, yet their trenches soon acquired a reputation for slovenliness and poor construction. Bodies were actually buried in the floor of the trenches, thereby making them shallower as the casualties mounted. The French attitude to the trench building was in part born of an unwillingness to admit a permanent enemy presence on their homeland and the desire to go on the offensive. With the onset of winter, the deadlock became total. Continuous trench lines now extended from the Belgian coast to the Swiss frontier. The Germans had not yet constructed the formidable defensive systems which, for most of the war, their overall strategy in the West would dictate. Believing in late 1914 that the building of a second position might weaken the resolve of the troops in the front defenses, the Germans depended at first on a single line. This line was to be held at all costs. However, during the winter, they revised this policy, adding depth to these defenses with concrete machine gun posts 1,000 yards to the rear of the front line. Having prepared for siege operations at the outset of the war, the Germans were comparatively well endowed with weapons suitable for trench warfare, including mortars, grenades, heavy guns, and howitzers. The BEF, however, was compelled to fashion improvised mortars from drain pipes and grenades from jam tins. All the armies were experiencing shell shortages. Falkenhayn later stated that the failure of just one ammunition train that winter threatened to render whole sections of the front defenseless. The French, requiring 50,000 rounds of 75mm ammunition daily, were producing only 11,000 rounds per day in mid-November 1914, while by January, some British 18-pounder guns were restricted to firing just 4 rounds a day. Casualty rates in 1914 hit the BEF particularly hard. As a small professional volunteer force, it could ill afford the loss of 3,627 officers and 86,237 men between August and December 1914. In Britain, Kitchener, who foresaw a long and costly war, had begun a vast expansion of Britain's military forces. He formed a series of new armies, each of which duplicated the 6 divisions of the original BEF. More than 1,186,000 volunteers enlisted in the first 5 months, but they would take time to train. Meanwhile, the British soldiers at the front were struggling to hold the line. Musketry standards had already declined and morale had slumped as the Germans made gains in minor operations at Givenchy in December. Christmas 1914 was marked by a spontaneous unofficial truce in Flanders, where German and British soldiers fraternized in no man's land, taking photographs, swapping souvenirs, and even playing football. On Christmas Eve, the soldiers in the field agreed not to fire on one another. That night, on a front where 5 days earlier there had been savage fighting, the guns fell silent. On the following morning, German soldiers walked across towards the British wire, and British soldiers went out to meet them. The soldiers appeared with souvenirs, capstars, and badges. The British gave the Germans plum pudding. The Germans invited their enemy into their trenches and serenaded them with Christmas songs. When the Germans began to bury some of their frozen dead, the British soldiers had another shock.
They would put, the Germans, for Vaterland und Freiheit, for fatherland and freedom. And I said to a German, "Excuse me, but how can you be fighting for freedom? You started the war, and we are fighting for freedom." And he said, "Excuse me, English camarade, but we are fighting for freedom, for our country." And I say, you also put, "Here rests in God an unbekannter, held. Here rests in God an unknown hero, in God." Oh yes, God is on our side. Blessed He's on our side. Well, English comrade, do not let us quarrel on Christmas Day.
The day after Christmas, infantrymen of both sides shouted warnings to their opposite number before opening fire. Hardening attitudes, as the war became increasingly bloody and impersonal, ensured that such incidents on this scale would not recur, but live and let live understandings accepted by both sides frequently prevailed in quiet sectors until the end of the war. Falkenhayn's decision in November 1914 to stand temporarily on the defensive in the West proved to be a huge mistake. A weakened and now inexperienced BEF might not have withstood further heavy blows during the winter. The respite granted by the Germans allowed the Allies to reorganize, giving Britain in particular the chance to train Kitchener's new armies and strengthen the BEF with additional territorial and Dominion contingents. Falkenhayn hoped that once the Russians had been pushed back over the Vistula, he would resume the offensive in the west. However, a combination of factors forced him to continue with a predominantly defensive operation, at least for the first part of the new year. The stage was set for the conquest of the hell called No Man's Land.
wasting water up the horizon slush, using the kind of language that makes the sergeant blush. Who wouldn't join the army? That's what we all inquire. Don't we pity the poor civilians sitting around the fire? Oh, 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 it's a lovely war. It's a lovely war. Wouldn't be a soldier, eh? Oh, it's a shame to take the pain. As soon as the valley is gone, we feel just as heavy as lead. But we never get up to the sergeant brings the breakfast up to bed. Oh, 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 it's a lovely war. Oh, what do we want with eggs and ham when we got plum and apple jam? Home for the right turn, how will we spend the money?